As you may well be aware, China has passed a new law in Beijing just last week, called the Safeguarding National Security in Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, or Hong Kong SAR. And it tragically spells the end of freedom enjoyed for over a century by the people living in the Special Autonomous Region of Hong Kong, the foundation of the entrepreneurial spirit and the prosperity of that city. Now, one might expect that the world would be united in condemnation, but far from it. The very body meant to speak for the world, the United Nations, voiced support for China's position. Like the World Health Authority before it, the United Nations lost its way and failed the world's free nations and its peoples. Many brave people continue to protest the loss of freedom, supposedly guaranteed by the Sino-UK agreement crafted on the 1st of July 1984 to be in place by 1997 when the UK passed the city back to the Chinese. Another international agreement casually swept away by the Chinese, who have shown a casual disregard for such things. The protesters continued to put their lives on the line as 10 of them were arrested on the night the law came into effect. All are now location unknown, and it's a wonder if any will ever see freedom again. The implementation date was the anniversary of the handover of Hong Kong from the UK to China, a signal to the British, no doubt. It was not so long ago that 80% of the residents of Hong Kong protested en masse when the Hong Kong legislature tried to pass an extradition bill, which would have allowed Hong Kong residents to be extradited to face trial in mainland China, where courts are controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. Such was the feeling of betrayal and a deep desire to protect freedoms enjoyed for over a century that the Hong Kong legislature eventually caved in and removed the bill. However, China did not give up the desire to extradite those it wanted in a Chinese prison, and they passed their own law to achieve the same goal. This time not in Hong Kong, this time in Beijing. Within a few hours of the law being passed, 10 dissenters were arrested, and in the early morning light in Hong Kong, a new security team took up residence in the Metro Park Hotel in Causeway Bay. Now, this hotel is just over the road from Victoria Park, where every year Hong Kong residents remember those that died when China murdered their way to ending the 1989 occupation of Tiananmen Square in an earlier crackdown on pro-democracy movement. Placing China's new security team here was not an accident. Another signal to Hong Kong, methinks. The Office for Safeguarding National Security of the Central People's Government, charged with overseeing implementation of the controversial new national security law for Hong Kong, held a ceremony in the very early hours of the morning. There was a heavy police presence outside the Metro Park Hotel in Hong Kong, which will serve as a temporary headquarters of the new office. Police had erected water barriers and put in place crowd control measures overnight, restricting residents and foreign media from even observing the ceremony. Even in the Hong Kong Parliament, though, opposition lawmakers sparred verbally with senior government officials over this sweeping new national security law in the city.
第一章嘅總則咧，係咧佢亦都寫清楚咧，特區係負有。
我想問下，係咪國安法已經超越埋基本法，甚至係改埋基本法啊？我同邵家臻議員都經歷過。
頭先議員問咗好多問題，不過咧，我覺得佢嘅問題，
我問咗一條啫，係咪已經超越埋基本法？
佢係基於一個對一國兩制完全誤解嘅情況。
我就係問你係咪超越埋基本法啊？
今日咧，林鄭講咗一句説話，佢話訂立國安法43條細則保障人權，難聽過粗口啊！
The new law punishes crimes of secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign forces with up to life in prison, heralding a more authoritarian era for China's only free city. Vague terms open up to almost any interpretation. And Beijing enacted the new legislation on June the 30th after it was drafted and passed without input of the Hong Kong government or its people. Opposition lawmakers held up blank white papers representing banned protest slogans or anything, I presume, that really they wanted to say, but that could have earned them a lifetime in prison. This is the first time mainland China security agencies have an enforcement presence in the streets of Hong Kong. And in an absolutely chilling press briefing the same day, Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam had this to say.
Surely, this is not doom and gloom for Hong Kong. I'm sure with the passage of time and efforts and the facts being laid out, confidence will grow in one country, two systems, and in Hong Kong's future. Well, if the Foreign Correspondents Club or all reporters in Hong Kong can give me 100% guarantee that they will not commit any offenses under this piece of national legislation, then I can do the same. So it is not a question of me standing here to give you a guarantee of what you may or may not do in the days and weeks and years ahead. But the law has clearly defined the 4 types of acts and activities which we need to prevent and curb and punish in accordance with the law. So that's my response to the reporters. This is a very important piece of legislation, and the central government has placed full trust and faith in the Hong Kong SAR. So the Hong Kong SAR government will vigorously implement this law, and I forewarn those radicals not to attempt to violate this law or crossing the red line, because the consequences of breaching this law are very serious.
International condemnation from some countries has been loud and clear. The British Foreign Minister had this to say.
This isn't a gross interference in domestic affairs. China freely assumed international obligations to the United Kingdom through the Joint Declaration, which is a treaty between China and the United Kingdom back in 1984, in relation to the way it would treat Hong Kong and in particular respect the autonomy and the freedoms. And therefore the important thing here, and it's a matter of trust, and lots of countries around the world are asking this question, does China live up to its international obligations? Because if they can't be trusted to keep their word on Hong Kong, why would they be trusted to live up to their wider international responsibilities?
And this from the US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo.
Yesterday, the Chinese Communist Party implemented its draconian national security law on Hong Kong in violation of commitments that it made to the Hong Kong people and to the United Kingdom, in a UN-registered treaty, and in contravention of Hong Kongers' human rights and fundamental freedoms. Free Hong Kong was one of the world's most stable, prosperous, and dynamic cities. Now it will be just another communist-run city where its people will be subject to the party elite's whims. It's sad. Indeed, this is already happening. Security forces are already rounding up Hong Kongers for daring to speak and think freely. The rule of law has been eviscerated. And as always, the Chinese Communist Party fears its own people more than anything else. The United States is deeply concerned about the law's sweeping provisions and the safety of everyone living in the territory, including Americans. Article 38 of the new law also purports to apply to offenses committed outside of Hong Kong by non-residents of Hong Kong, and this likely includes Americans. This is outrageous and an affront to all nations. We will continue to implement President Trump's directive to end Hong Kong's special status. Other federal agencies are involved as well. I applaud FCC Chairman Ajit Pai's for designating Huawei and ZTE as national security risks. We're also continuing to take action to build on President Trump's signing of the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act. Today, the United States Department of State, along with Treasury, Commerce, and DHS, are issuing a business advisory to companies with supply chain links to entities complicit in forced labor and other human rights abuses in Xinjiang and throughout China.
Some residents in Hong Kong continue to protest even now, placing their lives on the line to protect their freedoms. The residents of this former Hong Kong colony may decide to take flight, as country like Britain offers visas to millions, and Australia too is looking at a special visa category.
We stand for rules and obligations, and we think that is the soundest basis for our international relations. And the enactment and imposition of this national security law constitutes a clear and serious breach of the Sino-British Joint Declaration. It violates Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy and is in direct conflict with Hong Kong basic law. The law also threatens the freedoms and rights protected by the Joint Declaration. We made clear, Mr. Speaker, that if China continued down this path, we would introduce a new route for those with British national overseas status to enter the UK, granting them limited leave to remain, with the ability to live and work in the UK and thereafter to apply for citizenship, and that is precisely what we will do now.
Now, one might expect that the world would be united in condemnation, but far from it. The very body meant to speak for the world was split. Some in the United Nations voiced support for China's position. Like the World Health Authority before it, the United Nations has lost its way, and it's failed the world's free nations and its free peoples. To the Chinese, the UN support offered priceless propaganda. Take a look at this headline from Chinese state-controlled China Daily. 53 countries, yes, 53 in total, positively welcomed the adoption of the law on safeguarding national security in the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region at a United Nations Rights Council meeting in Geneva. Cuba's representative, speaking on behalf of the 53 countries, read a joint statement at the 44th session of the UN Human Rights Council. Non-interference in internal affairs of sovereign states is an essential principle enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations and a basic norm of international relations, the statement said. The statement continued that in any country, the legislative power on national security issues rests with the state alone, which in essence is not a human rights issue and therefore not subject to discussion at the Human Rights Council. We believe that every country has the right to safeguard its national security through legislation and commend relevant steps taken for this purpose, the statement said. In this context, the statement continued, we welcome the adoption of the decision by China's legislature to establish and improve a legal framework and enforcement mechanisms for HKSAR for the purpose of safeguarding national security, as well as China's reaffirmation of adherence to one country, two systems guidelines. Well, the statement on behalf of the 53 countries said new legislation will provide a better guarantee for the idea of one country, two systems, benefiting Hong Kong's long-term prosperity and stability, and ensure Hong Kong's people the exercise of legal rights and freedom in a safer environment. We reiterate that Hong Kong SAR is an inalienable part of China. Hong Kong affairs are China's internal affairs that allow no foreign interference, and we urge relevant parties to stop using Hong Kong-related issues to interfere in China's internal affairs. Well, all that, of course, is complete nonsense. Reductions of freedom of speech is a human rights issue. This law will only burden the people of Hong Kong under a heavy load to never speak against China's policies, or its leaders, or its representatives, or any other thing that the CPP might decide is subversive, and that is completely one-sided and open to the interpretation of the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing. A secretive, authoritarian, and communist dictatorship system, and if you speak out, you can be placed in prison for life. This is a human rights issue. Freedom of speech is a human rights issue. It is true that 53 countries supported them in the UN. That in itself is disturbing and annoying for sure. But for context, it's important to look at who was given the honour of delivering China's speech to the UN and to ask the simple question: who supported China and why they did it? Nonetheless, what is very disturbing was that there are more countries at the UN supporting China than those that condemned it. Wow. Now perhaps that's why the US left the UN some time ago. The United Nations voiced majority support for China's position. And like the World Health Authority before it, the United Nations seems to have lost its way and failed the world's free nations and the world's free people. The United Nations Human Rights Council, the UNHRC, is a United Nations body whose mission is to promote and protect human rights around the world. The UNHCR has 47 member states elected for staggered 3-year terms on a regional group basis. The Human Rights Council was established back in 2006 to replace the United Nations Beleaguered Human Rights Commission, established in 1946 just after the Second World War, which was largely discredited for allowing human rights abusers to be members. Remember that. That's not quite what the UNHRC says on its own website, though. It says the UNHRC was established in 1946 to weave the international legal fabric that protects our fundamental rights and freedoms. It says the Council is composed of 47 states members. Its brief expanded over time to allow it to respond to the whole range of human rights problems, and it sets standards to govern the conduct of states. It also says it acted as a forum for where countries large and small, non-governmental groups and human rights defenders from around the world could voice their concerns. So no mention of the fact that the original organisation set up after the war became so dominated by human rights abuses it was scrapped, and that's how history is airbrushed out and a cleaner, nicer, more kind of cuddly narrative is introduced. The stated objective of the UNHRC is to strengthen and protect human rights around the world and to address violations. But the Council, like the Commission before it, has also regularly been criticised for admitting members suspected of appalling human rights violations. Does anyone else have a feeling of, well, déjà vu? Déjà vu is the feeling that one has lived through the present situation before. And that's why they scrapped the Human Rights Commission. And to quote one of my favourite, quotes, George Santayana, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Well, thank you, George, once again, but really, I don't think they forgot. I really suspect foul play. Let's start with how UNHRC members are elected. Well, the Council, as we have seen, is made up of 47 member states, which are elected by a majority of members in the General Assembly of the United Nations through direct and, it says, secret ballot. The General Assembly takes into account the candidate state's contribution to the promotion and protection of human rights, as well as their voluntary pledges and commitments in this regard. Interesting.
Must not continue to go unaddressed.
The Council's membership is made up of equitable geographical distribution. Seats are defined as follows: African states, 13 seats; Asia-Pacific states, 13 seats; Latin American and Caribbean states, 8 seats; Western European and other states, 7 seats; Eastern European states, 6. With membership on the Council comes a responsibility to uphold high human rights, they say. This is from their website. This is a criteria insisted on by the states themselves when they adopted Resolution 60/251 in March of 2006 to create the Human Rights Council. Wow, that really does sound fantastic. I can see that if Africa and Asia, and even with Latin American support, all three could easily outvote Europe and even Europe plus the developed world. But who was the last country added to the Council? The United Nations General Assembly voted to add Venezuela to its 47-member Human Rights Council despite stringent opposition from activists denouncing the country's human rights record under its communist president, Nicolás Maduro. Hang on a moment. The Council elected a nation with an appalling human rights record to sit on the United Nations Human Rights Council. Well, that's just plainly wrong. I quote from the website once again, with membership on the Council comes a responsibility to uphold high human rights standards. And it's insisted upon by the states themselves when they adopted a resolution 60/251 in March of 2006 to create the Human Rights Council. That simply is wrong. The General Assembly, it says, takes into account the candidate states' contribution to the promotion and the protection of human rights, as well as their voluntary pledges and commitments in this regard. So how could the Council actually vote Venezuela on? Well, this does seem wrong, but in actuality, it's actually far worse. In an article in the New York Times, Philippe Bolopian, Deputy Director for Global Advocacy at Human Rights Watch, called the selection of Venezuela a slap in the face to the country's countless victims. Venezuela is an authoritarian, communistic state with most power in the hands of its president. It has been in a state of economic collapse, he says, for years, which has led to dangerous shortages of food, medication, and electricity. Among other abuses, Mr. Maduro and his administration have been accused of withholding from the public humanitarian aid from other nations and of manipulating voters in exchange for food and medical care. The United Nations' own humanitarian affairs chief estimated this spring that about 1/4 of Venezuela's population, or around 7 million people, were in need of humanitarian aid. Conditions there are so bad they have caused millions of Venezuelans to flee the country, largely on foot. Human rights activists urged the General Assembly's members, that's the United Nations General Assembly's members, to throw their support behind Costa Rica, which was competing with Venezuela and Brazil for 2 open Latin American and Caribbean seats on the Council. But in a recent vote, the Associated Press reported that Brazil won 153 votes and Venezuela 105, whilst Costa Rica only received 96. Mr. Bolopian wrote that the UN General Assembly should recognize that electing serial rights abusers like Venezuela betrays the fundamental principles it set out when it created the Human Rights Council. So the Council seems to be doing what the Commission did before it and was disbanded for, proving perhaps that the US was right to withdraw from this communistic and non-democratic controlled world body 2 years ago.
The Trump administration is committed to protecting and promoting the God-given dignity and freedom of every human being. Every individual has rights that are inherent and inviolable. They are given by God and not by government. Because of that, no government must take them away. For decades, the United States has led global efforts to promote human rights, often through multilateral institutions. While we have seen improvements in certain human rights situations, for far too long we have waited while that progress comes too slowly, or in some cases, never comes. Too many commitments have gone unfulfilled. President Trump wants to move the ball forward. From day one, he has called out institutions or countries who say one thing and do another, and that's precisely the problem at the Human Rights Council. As President Trump said at the UN General Assembly, it is a massive source of embarrassment to the United Nations that some governments with egregious human rights records sit on the Human Rights Council. We have no doubt that there was once a noble vision for this council. But today we need to be honest. The Human Rights Council is a poor defender of human rights. Worse than that, the Human Rights Council has become an exercise in shameless hypocrisy, with many of the world's worst human rights abuses going ignored, and some of the world's most serious offenders sitting on the council itself. The only thing worse than a council that does almost nothing to protect human rights is a council that covers for human rights abuses and is therefore an obstacle to progress and an impediment to change. The Human Rights Council enables abuses by absolving wrongdoers through silence and falsely condemning those who have committed no offense. A mere look around the world today demonstrates that the Council has failed in its stated objectives. Its membership includes authoritarian governments with unambiguous and abhorrent human rights records, such as China, Cuba, and Venezuela. There is no fair or competitive election process, and countries have colluded with one another to undermine the current method of selecting members. And the Council's continued and well-documented bias against Israel is unconscionable. Since its creation, the Council has adopted more resolutions condemning Israel than against the rest of the world combined. The United States has no opposition in principle to multilateral bodies working to protect human rights. We desire to work with our allies and partners on this critical objective that reflects America's commitment to freedom. But when organizations undermine our national interests and our allies, we will not be complicit. When they seek to infringe on our national sovereignty, we will not be silent. The United States, which leads the world in humanitarian assistance, and whose service members have sacrificed life and limb to free millions from oppression and tyranny, will not take lectures from hypocritical bodies and institutions as America selflessly give their blood and treasure to help the defenseless.
First, let's take a look at which countries voted with China. Amongst the nations that agreed to support China were all the world's dictatorships and communist states. The full list of countries supporting Hong Kong national security law are shown on your TVs right now, and as you can see, many countries on this list have their own very dubious, repressive human rights issues as well. These are the nations that support China. Nations that are in China's orbit, now they include North Korea, Iran, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Sierra Leone, Venezuela, and Sudan. Countries where freedom and human rights are concepts only dreamed about and outright violated on a daily basis. Palestine is on the list as a supporter of China, even though it's not yet a country, or even a democracy, and is itself accused of many human rights violations. Taiwan wasn't even allowed a seat at the table, even though it is a country and it has a democracy and it has a good human rights record. It also includes a host of countries dependent on China for financial support and connected very deeply in the Belt and Road initiatives with deep financial obligations to China, and others where functional democracy is a concept completely of fantasy. Other nations on that list are associated with state-sponsored murder of opponents at home or abroad. Even so, what is nonetheless very disturbing was that there are more countries at the UN Human Rights Council supporting China than those that condemned it. Absolutely, utterly amazing. The ex-US ambassador to the UNHCR, Nikki Haley, summed it up very nicely indeed.
For too long, the Human Rights Council has been a protector of human rights abusers and a cesspool of political bias. Regrettably, it is now clear that our call for reform was not heeded. Human rights abusers continue to serve on and be elected to the Council. The world's most inhumane regimes continue to escape scrutiny, and the Council continues politicizing and scapegoating of countries with positive human rights records in an attempt to distract from the abusers in their ranks. Therefore, as we said we would do a year ago, if we did not see any progress, the United States is officially withdrawing from the UN Human Rights Council. In doing so, I want to make it crystal clear that this step is not a retreat from human rights commitments. On the contrary, we take this step because our commitment does not allow us to remain a part of a hypocritical and self-serving organization that makes a mockery of human rights. Meanwhile, the situation on the Council has gotten worse, not better. One of our central goals was to prevent the world's worst human rights abusers from gaining Human Rights Council membership. What happened? In the past year, the Democratic Republic of Congo was elected as a member. The DRC is widely known to have one of the worst human rights records in the world. Even as it was being elected to membership in the Human Rights Council, mass graves continued to be discovered in the Congo. Another of our goals was to stop the Council from protecting the world's worst human rights abusers. What happened? The Council would not even have a meeting on the human rights conditions in Venezuela. Why? Because Venezuela is a member of the Human Rights Council, as is Cuba, as is China. Similarly, the Council failed to respond in December and January when the Iranian regime killed and arrested hundreds of citizens simply for expressing their views. When a so-called Human Rights Council cannot bring itself to address the massive abuses in Venezuela and Iran, and it welcomes the Democratic Republic of Congo as a new member, the Council ceases to be worthy of its name. Such a council, in fact, damages the cause of human rights. The Council is motivated by political bias, not by human rights. For all these reasons, the United States spent the past year engaged in a sincere effort to reform the Human Rights Council. It is worth examining why our efforts didn't succeed. At its core, there are two reasons. First, there are many unfree countries that simply do not want the Council to be effective. A credible Human Rights Council poses a real threat to them, so they oppose the steps that would create it. Look at the Council membership, and you see an appalling disrespect for the most basic human rights. These countries strongly resist any effort to expose their abusive practices. In fact, that's why many of them run for a seat on the Human Rights Council in the first place, to protect themselves from scrutiny. When we made it clear we would strongly pursue council reform, these countries came out of the woodwork to oppose it. Russia, China, Cuba, and Egypt all attempted to undermine our reform efforts this past year. We didn't agree with such a moral compromise when the previous UN Human Rights Commission was disbanded in 2006, and we don't agree with it now. Many of these countries argued that the United States should stay on the Human Rights Council because American participation is the last shred of credibility that the Council has. But that is precisely why we must leave. If the Human Rights Council is going to attack countries that uphold human rights and shield countries that abuse human rights, then America should not provide it with any credibility. Instead, we will continue to lead on human rights outside the misnamed Human Rights Council. Last year, during the United States presidency of the Security Council, we initiated the first ever Security Council session dedicated to the connection between human rights and peace and security. Despite protests and prohibitions, we did organize an event on Venezuela outside the Human Rights Council chambers in Geneva. And this past January, we did have a Security Council session on Iranian human rights in New York. I have traveled to UN refugee and internally displaced persons camps in Ethiopia, Congo, Turkey, and Jordan, and met with the victims of atrocities in those troubled regions. We have used America's voice and vote to defend human rights at the UN every day, and we will continue to do so. Even as we end our membership in the Human Rights Council, we will keep trying to strengthen the entire framework of the UN engagement on human rights issues, and we will continue to strongly advocate for reform of the Human Rights Council. Should it become reformed, we would be happy to rejoin it.
So the UNHCR Council has repeated the same mistakes as its predecessor, the UNHCR Commission. They didn't even bother to change the acronym. It's always been the UNHRC. It's dominated by nations who have the world's worst human rights abusers, such as the Democratic Republic of Congo, Venezuela, Cuba, China, Iran, Russia, and amongst many others. Such a council damages the credibility of its purpose and effectively ruins its name. The US did try to fix the UNHRC, but failed. Why? Because the Council/Commission continued to resist any attempts to change its organisation. It's a massive hypocrisy of world proportions, a tragedy that this organisation has failed in its stated mission. The only thing I cannot understand is why the UK is still a member, and why we don't scrap it and start again, ensuring that only countries with a good, clear and clean human rights record can join. Certainly no more money should be given to tyrannical regimes and the organisations they have come to so dominate. How the UNHRC became dominated by these rogue member states and the UNHRC's fixation on Israel will be looked at in future. My name is James Cordwell.